Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started since it's 11:10 to keep us on schedule. So I'll start by introducing myself. I am Tori Hanley. I'm a research scientist at the Northeastern University Marine Science Center, and I'm also the Metro Boston Regional Coordinator for Mass Bay's National Estuary Partnership. And as part of my role as the regional coordinator, I also coordinate the Boston Harbor Ecosystem Network in collaboration with our wonderful steering committee. And on behalf of BHEN and Mass Bays, I want to start by saying thank you to the incredible team at the Stone Living Lab who have made our first annual conference a reality, despite the best efforts of a global pandemic and a surprise nor'easter. I also want to thank everyone presenting and participating today in what we hope is the first of many events highlighting the breadth of research and work being done in and around Boston Harbor. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our series of lightning talks, featuring speakers from a variety of agencies, organizations, and institutions to highlight some of the many collaborative and multidisciplinary efforts happening in our coastal ecosystems and communities. These presentations will really nicely set the stage for this afternoon's breakout group discussions. So as Mark mentioned earlier, the lightning talk session will be followed directly by an Ask a Researcher poster session, during which time you will have the opportunity to ask questions and meet with the speakers in smaller groups in breakout rooms. In addition to meeting with the speakers, you'll also have the opportunity to meet with folks that are presenting posters. And I'm going to place that link in the chat right now. So to kick off our lightning talks, it is my pleasure to introduce Kirk Bosma. Kirk is a senior coastal engineer and innovation director at Woods Hole Group, as well as a member of Stone Living Lab's steering committee. And the title of Kirk's talk is Robust Monitoring of Nature-Based Approaches and Core Research Experiments. Thanks, Kirk.
Thanks, Tori. So I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the projects that's happening at Stone Living Lab. Driven by climate change, we're starting to see more and more nature-based approaches, nature-based solutions being implemented and developed across the US and in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But even so, we haven't really dug in to understand how well they perform. They're relatively new in many cases. And in a lot of situations, stakeholders, communities work really, really hard to get a project put in place. It costs a lot of money to design, develop, construct the project. And then what we're left with is, the lack of funding or sometimes motivation to really do a robust monitoring of that implementation or project or nature-based solution that was put in place. So the Stone Living Lab is doing that by really conducting some robust monitoring of some recently constructed hybrid nature-based solutions that scatter kind of across the Commonwealth. And all of these projects kind of share one similar trait, that they all have some element of a dynamic revetment, cobble berm, as a component of the overall nature-based approach. The goals of what we're really after here in this particular project was to gather baseline and comparative data of performance, looking at the stability, the sustainability, the performance levels, side effects, maintenance requirements, potentially detrimental impacts associated with some of these nature-based solutions. So we're really trying to get information on that prior to the project being constructed, if possible, as well as post-construction. Second goal is to gather data that we can really use to improve the design parameters of these types of solutions. So more and more of these are getting implemented, but they're not a traditional coastal approach to protection. So what size, grain size really makes sense? How should it be layered? What size? What's the width? Volume requirements do you need to really have effective performance and work within the framework of the ecology that exists on various shorelines? We're also collecting data for developing numerical model performance of these situations. So prior to actually implementing or constructing a nature-based solution such as a dynamic revetment, what if we could more accurately model and simulate how they would react and how they would work prior to spending the money to actually build them? So that's another data collection stream. Really looking to demonstrate the benefit of this more robust monitoring. As I mentioned, it's hard sometimes for stakeholders to really put up the funding to, just build the thing and then have 5-10 years after that of monitoring costs. So, but does that monitoring really help things go further? So could we influence the policy of those monitoring? And then the last piece is we're providing a linkage to some of the baseline work and experiments that we're going to propose on Rainsford Island, where we're really looking at a large scale dynamic revetment where we can change it, evolve it, and really understand better how these things really perform and work. There's 4 sites we're monitoring at. There's Coughlin Park in Winthrop. There's 2 sites at Duxbury Beach in Duxbury and 1 in Chilmark, Massachusetts. They vary quite a bit in terms of wave exposure, energy. A couple of them have salt marshes right in the vicinity, pre-existing salt marshes. So we want to see what impact these nature-based solutions have on existing wetland resources that are in place. So we're monitoring all 4 of those sites for 4 years on a biannual or quarterly basis. We're looking at salt marsh integrity and extent, coverage at all 4 sites. We're looking at geomorphic evolution through both drone-based surveys, citizen science profiling, and engineering surveys at all 4 sites. We're looking at some rocky intertidal habitat and ecology at all 4 sites. So what lives and could possibly live within these rocky intertidal habitats. And then we're doing some coastal processes monitoring as well, looking at the waves and currents with actual instruments measuring the physical processes that are happening out there. So that's just a real quick summary of one of our comprehensive monitoring approaches. We're going to get a lot of comparative data, be able to compare the sites, how they work, and apply that going forward. And I would like to apologize up front. Due to my crazy schedule, I am not actually going to be at the Ask a Researcher session. I have former commitments, but you can gladly email me with any questions, kbosma@woodsholegroup.com, if you have follow-up questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirk. That was wonderful. And I'll also put in a plug following Kirk's great presentation that we are going to have a field trip to Coughlin Park. So you'll have an opportunity to see this site firsthand. The field trip was scheduled for tomorrow, but as we know, the weather has decided to not cooperate at all this week. So we're in the process of rescheduling it. But if you're interested, I'll share the link to register for that event, or you can reach out to me. Thanks very much, Kirk. I really appreciate it. Next up, we have Julia Nizal. Julia is the Coastal Shoreline and Floodplain Manager at Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. And Julia is also a member of Stone Living Lab's Scientific Advisory Committee. And today, Julia will be talking about goal-based monitoring of vulnerable shorelines and restoration approaches. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Tori, for the introduction. And I'm really happy to follow on Kirk's presentation. The projects that he mentioned, many of them were actually funded by the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management's Coastal Resilience Grant Program, which we launched in 2014 to help communities and nonprofit organizations restore natural buffers that are open and accessible to the public. And we're really committed to bringing back sediment into sediment-starved systems, using native vegetation to stabilize that sediment, and then also exploring other methods to attenuate waves and provide long-term resilience in our communities. Since 2014, CZM has actually worked with communities and nonprofits to construct 11 projects from the North Shore out to Martha's Vineyard, and we're really proud of that. We have 3 more projects that are being constructed this year. So that'll bring us up to 14 implemented projects since we launched the program. And there's actually a number of projects that are in the pipeline now going through design and permitting. So we'll be seeing more in the next couple of years. The approaches, like I mentioned, range from bringing in sediment to do traditional dune restoration, but also Kirk mentioned the interest in cobble berms. We're also supporting those types of projects and exploring how fringing salt marsh environments can provide not only shoreline stability, but also over time, a buffer for floodwaters as well. So we actually try and take a low cost approach to monitoring, where Kirk is doing, more sophisticated monitoring from an engineering perspective. We're working with local partners to observe impacts to the project area as a result of storms and also seasonality. And we're also looking at the performance of project components. How well do biodegradable materials hold up? What is the life expectancy if they're exposed to water, excuse me, sunlight, and trampling from visitors at park environments? Excuse me, I'm sorry, not. So we're getting good information on best practices of these projects that we're actually able to feed into a regional network that we have with our Northeast partners, with the coastal programs and the federal agencies. We've been able to work with our partners within the Northeast Regional Ocean Council to strengthen projects moving forward in terms of how well we're using the biodegradable materials and other techniques to do the nature-based restoration. We're actually really excited that we're wrapping up a project with the regional partners this December, and we'll be releasing a monitoring guidance document that lays out the metrics that should be considered when monitoring, and then also highlighting the published protocols that currently exist so that we can best inform projects moving forward to make sure that we're really developing really sound messaging around these projects and best practices for implementation moving forward. So I'm really happy to participate in the breakout session, and I will be happy to talk in more detail about a couple of the projects that our staff are monitoring with our local partners. We've got a living shoreline project in Salem at Collins Cove, where we did an 800 linear foot restoration of the shoreline there with a high and low marsh planting. And we also have, as Kirk mentioned, the coastal bank stabilization project at Coughlin Park in Winthrop that has a really nice upland vegetative buffer that is well established and we're proud of. So I hope to be able to chat with you a lot in the next session. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. That was a really nice overview of the many efforts that CZM is leading and has contributed to. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jarrett Burns. Jarrett is an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and is a member of the Stone Living Lab's Research and Monitoring Committee. Jarrett will be talking about establishing baselines to evaluate shoreline modifications as part of the Stone Living Lab. Thanks very much, Jarrett.
Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction, Tori. I am part of the Stone Living Lab as an ecologist. So my background and my lab is classically a community ecology lab. In particular, we're interested in looking at coastal ecology and impacts of climate change, sea level rise, and other global change drivers. As a part of Stone Living Lab, we've been handed really an unprecedented opportunity to look at the future of our shorelines as we consider nature-based solutions. As we begin to work with Rainsford Island and try and look at potential nature-based solutions and how they would play out in and around Rainsford, my lab has been tasked with trying to evaluate ecological impacts. And so what we've been doing is trying to think about what would a community, an ecological community, either in the intertidal or shallow subtidal, look like in the future? How will our continued modification of the shoreline change the very life in the ocean upon which we derive so many benefits and ecosystem services? In so doing, we're using a classic before-after control impact design, and it's something that I think can be deployed at many of the different projects that occur in the future to fully evaluate how we change life in the sea. In essence, we're using Rainsford as a quote-unquote treatment island, our impact island, and as the Stone Living Lab works with Rainsford and looks at different coastal solutions on the northern end, we're going to be able to look at the changes in ocean life that happen there, but not in isolation, right? If you just look at what's happening on Rainsford, you're not really going to get a picture of how these coastal protection structures and nature-based solutions may truly change life in the sea. Rather, we're also surveying Pettix, Georges, and Gallops as our so-called controls and looking at how does life in the ocean change on those islands relative to Rainsford as we continue forward. So as a part of this, we're using relatively new actual international standards from the Global Ocean Observing System to establish surveys in the intertidal, to look at remotely operated vehicle surveys in the nearshore subtidal. We tried to deploy divers, but those currents are ripping, as well as measurements of ecosystem functions. This summer, we conducted our first round of this in order to begin to establish a baseline as we move into the future as the Stone Living Laboratory. Now, what's great about this data is that while it's going to be useful for evaluating any changes that occur in the marine life in the surrounding area, it also has a number of ancillary benefits. One, we're providing high quality and consistent ecological monitoring data in a portion of Boston Harbor where that is relatively depauperate in that kind of data. We'll be able to look at change through time, not just due to the activities of the Stone Living Lab, but also as environmental change continues through in Boston Harbor itself. Second, this pairs really nicely with several other long-term monitoring programs that my lab has set up over the years in Salem Harbor and in the outer Boston Harbor Islands, so we can look at whether or not change that we're seeing is really reflective of recent change, or if it compares against a baseline of ocean change that we see over longer time series. And last, it's a really unparalleled educational opportunity. So we've already begun working with undergraduates and recent graduates as technicians as part of this program, getting them educated in the natural history of the Boston Harbor Islands, getting them to develop a sense of place and a sense of the ecology of these dynamic islands, something that they are going to be taking forward with them into the future. That, and we've partnered with two different research experience for undergraduate programs at UMass Boston in order to have students come in. And what we've been doing with these students is not just allowing them to participate in the program, but really start to help us develop areas that meet their intellectual interests. So that way we get something new out of it, new measurements, but also allow these students to take some intellectual ownership and launch their careers forward. So I'm excited to talk to you guys later in the Meet a Researcher session. We can talk about data, which will be available shortly, as well as some maps that we've been building up to show where different things are in the harbor. So get to know your harbor better, get to know where the mussels are, where the seaweed is, and what species you might be interested in. I'm always a kelp guy myself, and I look forward to talking to you then.
Thanks very much, Jarrett. It's wonderful to hear about the really interesting research that you and your lab group are doing, as well as the educational and training opportunities that have come out of this collaboration with the Stone Living Lab. Thanks very much. Next up, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Megan Rokop. Megan is the Associate Dean of the Honors College at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And Megan will be talking today about looking more carefully, a Boston Harbor BioBlitz activity for college orientation. Thanks very much, Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about a specific study that's been a collaboration between the Mass Boston Honors College and also the National Park Service, actually since 2017. And a bunch of the folks who have been working on this project are actually in the conference today. So I'm just going to put the author line for our study in the chat window there so that you guys can see the other folks who've been working on this. So basically what I'm going to be telling you about is a Boston Harbor BioBlitz activity for college students on their freshman orientation. And as I said, this is a partnership between the Honors College at UMass Boston and the National Park Service. And it's a citizen science project that happens on trips to Thompson Island that are for incoming first-year students to the Honors College. Our goals for this project have been to create an engaging citizen science project on the Boston Harbor Islands for all majors of students with no prior background. And we have iterated this project so far over 3 summers on Thompson Island, hoping to bring insights that can improve future citizen science projects in the future, especially with students, college-age students. So we've been doing this over 3 summers from 2017 to 2019 for a total of over 450 freshmen on these overnight trips to Thompson Island. And the citizen science activity that we've set up is a 3-hour activity where the students are documenting the biodiversity on Thompson Island using the app iNaturalist to document with photos the species they find, and then also to identify those species, or to take advantage of the international community on iNaturalist to help them identify those species. So the way this activity works is basically the students take a short pre-survey and then they get a short training. Then the vast majority of the activity, they're out in the field on Thompson Island taking images of all the types of organisms they can find on the island. And then they come back and do a short debrief with the National Park Service rangers and then take a short post-survey. So what we're using these pre and post surveys for, the pre-survey is really to determine their level of background knowledge. And then in order to determine the engagement, their levels of engagement in the activity, we use several different methods. One is the post survey for self-reporting. We also track the number of observations that they make using the iNaturalist app. And then we also observe them out in the field to see what is particularly exciting or engaging to them. And we made several changes after our first summer that we're hoping are increasing their engagement in subsequent years. So our findings, so these students basically have very little background knowledge in the field. 93% of them had never heard the word citizen science, and 98% of them had never heard of iNaturalist. So we're really engaging students who don't really have any prior background in the field at all. And the engagement levels we were very pleased by. So over 60% of students were very or extremely engaged in the activity. And what we found is the majority of students indicated that they were extremely interested in learning about citizen science or participating in citizen science in the future, and also in returning to the Boston Harbor Islands. For most of them, it had been their first time on the Boston Harbor Islands. And also over 70% of them believed that their data were important to the islands and to the National Park Service. We also tracked their engagement by actually tracking the number of observations that they made. And we saw after some changes we made after the first year that the number of observations they made increased. And our collaborators who have a study in press in the journal Citizen Science Theory and Practice also found that the quality of their data increased. And so our collaborators found that these students are actually making useful contributions, and this biodiversity documentation activity really is an authentic scientific activity that is useful to park managers and to scientists. So I thought I would just end by telling you a couple of the changes that we made that seem to be helping increase these levels of engagement. So one is how we were doing the introductory presentation for the students during the training. What we did in a couple of the later years was to show them actual examples of high quality observations that were made by the students the year before. And we were basically trying to show the students how many observations the students the year before had made, how many of those had actually been identified by members of the international iNaturalist community, and how many of those identifications were actually research grade. So we wanted to show the students that the data they were collecting were significant to the community. And on top of that, we also created incentives like prizes if they, beat the students from the years before, got more observations from them or more research grade observations, and kind of won that competition. And then we also made a couple of other changes, like, for instance, giving the students an option to return early so that they could spend more time on identifying, like working with rangers to do identifications, or the other option was to spend more time out in the field. So in summary, we have created a really fruitful campus community collaboration between the UMass Boston Honors College and the National Park Service in creating a citizen science project that is really engaging to students of all majors, regardless of prior background, either with citizen science or just with the Boston and Harbor Islands in general. So thank you guys for listening, and also thanks to everyone that I put in the chat window there. I will be in the Ask a Researcher session, and a bunch of those folks on the author line are also here, so you can ask them questions as well. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks very much, Megan. That was a really exciting overview of the wonderful community science efforts that you all have been leading at the Boston Harbor Islands. So thanks for sharing that. Next up, I am excited to introduce Melanie Garate. Melanie is the Climate Resilience Manager at the Mystic River Watershed Association. And today, Melanie will be speaking about regional climate resilience for people and place. Thanks for being here today, Melanie.
Thanks so much for that warm welcome, and hello, everybody. I apologize if for 1 second I need to sneeze or take some time off the screen. Those seasonal flus that are catching up to all of us have finally hit me. But thank you very much. I am happy to chat today about the Resilient Mystic Collaborative and our couple of projects that are really trying to bring regional climate resilience for people and place to the Boston area. And so I'll back up by sharing the Mystic River Watershed Association is hosting a collaborative called the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, or the RMC, that I will put into the chat so you can check us out online. And we are a regional collaborative that is trying to work together to fill in the gap of regional government structure to deal with climate change and build resilience that no one municipality can build alone. And so we know that with climate change doesn't know any municipal boundaries. It does know where the rivers used to flow or where salt marshes used to be. And so with the onset of extreme storm surge or sea level rise, we really need to build this capacity at a regional scale in order to tackle these problems that affect multiple areas within our watershed. And so the Resilient Mystic Collaborative is comprised of 20 out of the 21 municipalities within our watershed that include places like Everett, Somerville, Revere, East Boston, and Chelsea that are also environmental justice communities. And so not only do we want to bring forth regional climate strategies, but we also want to think and include those folks who are most impacted by climate, but often receive little to no benefit of the solutions that we put into place, whether that's decarbonization or creating resiliency and adapting to our changing world. And so one of those projects is called Wicked Hot Mystic, because it's just getting wicked hot in the Boston area. And we are really used to thinking of ourselves as a blizzard culture, as a storm, winter storm culture, and that's where we need to put our dollars into and our built infrastructure into. However, with the change in climate, we're getting increasing extreme heat temperatures throughout the summertime. And if you all remember back to this summer, we got a heat wave even before it was officially summertime at the end of May and early June. And so what our project seeks to identify is where is it hotter within our watershed, and then where can we implement solutions? The urban heat island effect makes it so that not everywhere is the same temperature. And so in cities and other built environments, the temperature can be actually 20 degrees or up to 20 degrees warmer than in surrounding greener areas with less built infrastructure. And so we set out to do a citizen science campaign, which I call a volunteer science campaign, to move away from using the problematic word in the United States of citizenship. And so in this volunteer science campaign, we came up with 20 car routes for folks to drive through within our individual municipalities. And within those cars, there are two sensors. One is for ambient temperature, and the other is for air quality, 2.5 particulate matter. And so from those transects that were collected in the heat wave in August, we're then able to take all of that information and develop a map to identify where those hotspots are, where those urban heat islands are, and then focus our attention, to the top 5 or so municipalities that are facing the biggest urban heat island impact. And so we, again, were able to collect all of that data in August, and now we have the really great privilege to analyze that data and identify those top urban heat islands within our watershed, and then move on to phase 2 of the project that will actually hopefully last for several more years, but beyond this year, because then we can move into the community engagement portion that then does a deep dive into what does the community want for those areas. Do they want more trees? What do they need in the short term? Do those buildings need more air conditioning or insulation? Do we need white roofs? And so now we're moving into that portion and then be able to help protect people and help protect place. And so we'll have those maps for you and for me as well by the end of the year, in which we'll be able to share that all with you. And then hopefully some, if not all of you, can also participate in the stakeholder feedback as to how do we move on and also adapt our municipalities, our watershed, to live with heat. And so with that, I will leave that there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melanie. It's really exciting to hear about all the great work that the Mystic River Watershed Association is doing to focus on resilience across municipal boundaries. I think that's key to the next step in the future. So thank you. And last but not least, for our lightning talk session, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jessica Tarassian. So Jess recently received her PhD in ecology, evolution, and marine biology from Northeastern University, and is currently an operations research analyst at the U.S. Department of Transportation Volpe Center. And today, Jess will be talking about tide gates, balancing the needs of people and natural ecosystems in urban settings. Thanks very much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Tori. And as a federal employee, I have to give the normal caveat that this is work that I participated in when I was at Northeastern in my personal capacity. And so the views on this talk don't necessarily represent those of the US government or the Department of Transportation. So just to start, there's quite a few tide gates in the greater Boston area that exist in these coastal and marsh ecosystems. Many of the tide gates that are still in place today were originally built in the 1700s, and they're meant to serve sort of as a controllable dam between ocean water coming in from the downstream side and probably low-lying property and infrastructure on the upstream side. And even in sort of the 1700s, the purpose of these tide gates was to try to balance the needs of this low-lying property that's usually quite valuable. It might have been farmland, it might have been homes, and the ecosystem services that these marshes are providing. So salt, hay, fisheries, and even today we've started recognizing other really important key ecosystem services that marshes provide us. Recreation, still fisheries support, but nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and then they also serve really important roles in buffering storm surge and wave energy that we start to see from these more powerful coastal storms that we're getting as climate change increases. And so the intended function of a tide gate is really to serve as sort of a temporary dam as the tide comes in. Depending on how a tide gate is constructed, it could either be an automatic gate that either mechanically or sort of kind of analog float system like your toilet, which, you know, when the float comes up, it trips the gate and it closes. Or it could be manual. Someone might have to come out and press the button if they know that a big storm is coming. What actually happens in these coastal systems is that you've got mechanical infrastructure that can fail. You have sort of these shiny objects that people may want to come and mess with. Sometimes floats get removed, sometimes rocks get thrown at the mechanisms that operate the gates, and sometimes they don't always work properly. So when that happens, they can close in either an open position, which can cause catastrophic flooding to a lot of the homes, especially in the town of Revere that are built right in that floodplain. Or they can fail in the closed position, which from a town management perspective is great because you don't have to worry about the homes flooding, but there's some pretty serious ecosystem impacts that can occur. And somewhat counterintuitively, when the gate fails in a closed position, it's not allowing salt water to flood the ecosystem daily. What this does is it allows for an invasive grass called Phragmites to invade. Phragmites forms these kind of dense stands of tall reeds, and they can be flammable. So in the town of Revere, what's happened in the past is where the tide gate is situated, there's actually a commuter rail line that comes through. And this commuter rail line can often throw sparks. Sometimes on the other side of the marsh, there's a roadway where people sometimes throw cigarettes out the window. So the marsh grass is actually caught on fire. So even though you're protecting these homes from flooding, which seems great by keeping the gate closed, you actually do need to keep the gate open to allow some of this salt water to flood in on a day-to-day basis to also prevent these potential fire impacts, which people in the town have seen in the past. So you're kind of trying to manage both flood and fire at different times of the year. But in addition to the ecosystem impacts that allow Phragmites to invade, there are other impacts to some of those other ecosystem services that I talked about earlier. So one of the things that Northeastern University did a few years back in collaboration with Eric Hutchins at NOAA, who was doing a restoration project at the Oak Island Tide Gate in Revere, was that we decided to start to monitor what weather variables, what was going on with the weather, what was going on with the water quality, to try to figure out if there was a better way that we could help kind of make decisions about how these tide gates are managed, maybe help inform tide gate design in the future. And what happened when we were doing that was that pretty soon after, the tide gate actually failed in a closed position. So we had this really interesting natural experiment where we had data from before, data from the closure, and I will be available at the Ask a Researcher session with some of that information about what happened. But you know, you see the water freshen really quickly. You see a lot more variability in temperature that can impact some of the forage fish species that live in the marsh. And so we're still kind of analyzing that data to try to figure out what it means for decision making. But I do think that this town of Revere is a really interesting case study, and it does show how you can kind of manage the tide gate in a way that's benefiting the ecosystem. The restoration that NOAA was working on is going really well. And the Spartina is coming back and the Phragmites is staying away. So I think it's a really useful case study, and I hope we'll be able to monitor it for a long time to come.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Jess, for sharing the really great work that you all have been doing to better understand the tide gates in the region. It's, as you mentioned, there's a lot of them, so it's key that we really get a better understanding of their effects. And now I just want to quickly thank again all of our speakers for a really wonderful series of lightning talks. Again, you've really set the stage nicely for our breakout group discussions this afternoon.